how can we redescribe the objective, like advancing substrate-independent minds, getting away for a moment from words like uploading, because that's very confusing, but it's the same basic principle. The idea is take the functions of the mind, those that make what we are work, and put them in other substrates. Make them work in computers or machines or biological organisms of a different kind or whatever you may come up with. Be able to run that in another substrate. And what do we have to do? We need to make a step back, understand our fundamental objective, what the problems are, what possible solutions are, look at possible different technologies, and then move on from there to make a roadmap and keep on pursuing that in an interdisciplinary manner. Today the topic is hopefully more down-to-earth, actionables, things that we can do right now. I'm going to start off with what I've entitled fundamentals. All of today is interactive work, so there's a lot of discussion, very little presentation. The idea is that we're going to get something new out of this, understand more about the questions. And what I mean by fundamentals is, okay, I wanted to say a few things about the type of problems that we encounter in dealing with substrate-independent minds and how to make substrate-independent minds. And I'm not going to explain all the possible fundamentals because we don't have time for that and because I'd like to keep the presentation part short. So instead, I'm only going to talk about two pieces that seemed interesting yesterday. And those were the matter of scale and resolution. So, okay, I'll get into that in a second. And me programs. And I'll explain what me programs is as we go. By the way, if you want to shout out a question or something right through my talk, please do, because I don't care, I don't mind, it's fine. So scale and resolution. First things I want to throw out there is that there are a lot of different resolutions that you might consider appropriate for the reconstruction of functions of mind. You might think that it's sufficient to look at, let's say, a group of neurons, and maybe an area as large as the kind of area that you can pick up when you're looking at fMRI images, and maybe even the uptake of oxygen is enough to understand what's going on in the brain, and you can just deal with that. Perhaps that's not sufficient resolution to see the kinds of functions that are being carried out in the brain and to understand what they're doing. Maybe instead you have to drill down to groups of neurons and their activity, maybe in terms of oscillations, perhaps in the sense of how do many of them together create a certain pattern, a certain rate of activity. Or you may have to drill down to the specific spiking activity and the times at which spikes occur at various neurons in the brain, maybe all the neurons in the brain. Or you may have to look at the distribution of action of potential throughout the morphology of every neuron in the brain, understand those that are being transmitted to every synapse and how that functions. You may have to drill down. Which resolution would it be? We just got a bunch of new real-life attendees, so the chairs are finally filling up again. Okay, so this is beginning to look more like yesterday. That's good. Okay, 1 second here as everyone gets settled. Right. Oh, line of sight is important? Okay. Yeah.
Line of sight improves.
It does. Okay. Okay, we're going to start discussing what you see on the slide here. If anyone can hear what I'm saying. Yeah? Is there? Yeah. Can you hear me? I hear them through the headphones. Okay, so there's no. So we can't just give the sound to everybody? So, yeah, because we still have the speakers. I mean, we can do that. Okay, let's see if we can get them on there. Yeah, that's fine. Hello? Can anybody here hear me?
Yes, yes, you can.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I guess this is better. Well, cutting to the chase, we're going to try to talk about what's on that slide there. Well, how can we understand what resolution would be needed to recreate functions of the mind in some other substrate? And the first question that I put up there is, does it depend on what you're using them for? Also, can we constrain them by the task that they're carrying out or the environment and that they're processing signals from? And are there any further constraints that we can learn about? So please do throw out some questions now, and I mean some ideas, and let's talk about it. I'm sure that the people here have had plenty of time to look at the slide now, so there must be some ideas floating around. Well, we could start with that, for example. So if you want to talk about the kind of purpose and how that might affect those resolutions, then that's a good idea. Yeah. That's the, well, yes, that's the main reason for looking at the objective of substrate-independent minds. So that's indeed where we started off. But we're not constrained to just that. I mean, we can also consider how can you use what you learn about from the brain to make any other kind of system that would be using the same type of functions. So an artificial intelligence, for example. Yeah.
Be able to make an artificial intelligence. The mind-overlaying problem is just so hard to be able to make an artificial intelligence quite superior to the human brain, just through the understanding of the human brain as the technology to output it.
So use a human brain as the template for an AGI.
Is it not necessarily as a template, but as to be able to to be able to understand how the different parts work together, and of course there's sort of like there's brain-inspired things, and then there's kind of, I think there's different conceptual levels there up to the point where it's almost a full template. Where are each of those templates? Where do you get enough inspiration so that the best of our software engineering can create an AI using some of those ideas? And when do you get to a template that you just need to go tweak some things and make it work, and then you can.
Okay, that would be one of the things you could use it for. And then, if that's the purpose, what does this tell us about how you would go about making such a, well, let's not call it template, but how to find out things about the brain, given that that's your purpose? Do you have to then drill down to the level where you understand what every neuron in the brain is doing and how they're all interacting via spikes or in terms of potential throughout the morphology of those neurons? Where would you, how does that affect what you're looking at there?
One problem is definitional. You actually have to preserve the entire mind, so I can imagine modeling a piece of brain.
Right.
Getting some functionality from that, and I can certainly get
Okay. So that's actually one of the points then, because the question is for scale and resolution, and I guess if you're only looking at a part of it, then the scale is much smaller, because you're only interested in some piece. Right, so scale depends definitely on that. Yeah. I didn't mention consciousness as far as I remember, but yeah. Certain, yeah. No.
Just a certain, I think the answer is yes, it depends on the purpose.
Okay, so for scale, certainly, yeah. Yeah.
I don't think it's an overthink. Think of what you want to do. You can also look at it at a level of brain damage. You take someone with Alzheimer's, some approximation of having bad resolution. They still have a functional brain, like
Yeah, so you,
an example.
right.
It would seem that sort of pathological examples would help you to define the types of purposes. You have those instances of damage that represent correlation with poor performance, but getting higher resolution simulation, image and simulation would let you understand better systems that are missing in mind. Damage. Interior sequence.
So,
As there are less and so neurons processing output. Neurons pick up their own and then they that much they have complicated forms. And what we're really looking for is an abstraction where you have levers of each file. So the question is, what does that abstraction look like? What terms does it
get up to this, and then magic happens. Higher order here, and you don't have very access to all of the information. So you're looking for very organisms response, but that's not necessarily insignificant.
Right. That's basically, you've got a black box and you're only modeling the input and the output. So only over the period of time where you're observing what's going on, you get some idea of what the functions underneath are, but you don't know what could be going on a lot earlier or much later, so which other functions might actually be implemented in there.
For example, it's such a small part of that space.
Right.
That
Yeah. Okay, I'll try to do that. Okay, so yeah, I might just have to put them on. So this really makes it harder for me to hear what people are saying. Yeah, it's not so easy. Okay, maybe sort of off to the side or something. Right, so yeah, Max Hodek was just pointing out that one problem with making assumptions about what kind of functions are in a piece of the brain, let's just say, if we look at it and measure responses while an animal is carrying out a behavior, is that we're really only learning about the functions that you can see while that behavior is taking place. You only know about things that happen while this black box is receiving certain inputs and creating certain outputs. You don't know anything else about what kind of functions are implemented in that black box if you're doing it that way. So that was one issue about how you might have to look at this problem. So, yeah. Okay, so does that relate to the question of can we constrain by task and environment, for example? So basically, if a certain system is carrying out just this task, then we're only learning about those functions that are in there, and it doesn't tell us anything about what else that system may be doing? Or is that a different question? Max, is there a way you would summarize that just so I can convey that to the virtual audience?
in order to say that, in order to make a statement about being constrained by environment, you have to understand how higher order behavior is an emergent property of large networks. Take it for granted, but no one can drive why you get this is sort of drive why and out of complicated.
Okay, let me see if I get that right. So basically what you're trying to say is that we can't really constrain by environment unless we know what about the environment. We know what it really means to the system. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so one application, knowledge management, or yeah, right. Okay, so Okay, this sounds very similar to what Derek was saying, that basically depending on your task, you can cut away a lot of parts of the brain and say we only need to look at this one piece. Okay, so then you have also the cutting away time, saying you only need to know what's going on in a specific period of time. Right. Right. In my head, I'm trying to understand how what we've just all talked about, how this affects how you would actually go to a person's brain, let's say, and try to extract the information that you would need to reconstruct that in a function. So when we're saying what is the resolution or the scale that you would have to look at, how is that affected by all these things? What does it say about the resolution, for example?
Sorry. Place to start with is say you need only the spike rate.
Okay, so Max is suggesting that we can start by looking at either just the spike train or also chemical interactions.
That was the major. That was the base boundary of where say spike.
Right. Yes. Yes, that was indeed the battle yesterday. It was about whether it was enough to look at just spikes or if we needed to consider more. Yeah.
It's a specific between function.
Well, that was really my first question because, okay, Shane Legg is basically asking, what are we talking about? Are we talking about extracting functions that are from a specific person, basically re-implementing a specific person in a sense, or is it more general, right? Is that giving the... Right, or whether it could be an artificial intelligence or something, yeah. Right, that's actually my question. Would you indeed give different answers to that then? And what would the answers be? Because we do start, indeed, the first thing we do is we started with the idea, okay, we would really like to re-implement a specific person's mind. That's why the next question on our list, I mean, I don't think you were here for the very beginning of this. We're going to talk about this idea of me programs as a way of introducing the difference. Me programs, I'll explain what that is. But it's this idea of having difference between a generic person and what may differ between a generic person and all other people, like what is the difference there. It's sort of just a concept, but I'll explain. Sorry? Peter agrees. Okay. Yeah. The thing is, I was trying to get at, if we start with the notion of being able to put a specific person's mind functions in some other substrate for whatever your purpose is, and some of you haven't been here, weren't here yesterday, so we discussed a lot of why would you do this and what is behind that idea and how would you do it. And today we're trying to look at specifically how can you move forward with this in a feasible manner. What kind of experiments can we do? And so I'm trying to get at this. Okay, if that's the first principle, how can we get a person's individual mind functions somewhere, then we're thinking about what would be the resolution or the scale that we need to look at there, and we need to consider that a certain problem. But how does that differ, for example, when we don't have that as a purpose? Does that matter at all? I think that we might be able to learn from how that differs to understand what is significant for an individual person's functions, for instance, because if there is a difference between trying to understand generic mind functions and an individual person's mind functions, and it affects the resolution at which you're looking at, then that says something about which resolution is significant, and why, and for what purpose. So that's what I'm trying to get at, really.
It seems like that relates very strongly to the totality of mind as a system, and subsets would be like one resolution, and the subcomponents of a subset of the mind would be a separate resolution. But the idea of the total mind capturing its dynamic processes means that the scanning technique that we heard about yesterday in great detail, the scanning electron microscope, scanning the tape, slices of the brain, doesn't capture the dynamic processes of the subcellular parts imaged. So So it seems like that if you're going to capture the mind as a total entity, you would have to capture it in its dynamic process and see how it changes over time, and also measure the data going into the mind, like rather than just the brain in isolation. So the well, all of the above, if you're going to approach it from a cellular and subcellular granularity up to the totality of mind, for capturing me, for capturing for capturing general brain and understanding brain functionality in general, maybe not even within the human species, trans-species, and then also going to abstract mind, independent. So as a physical process, as physics, what makes
Right.
mind?
Not the same intelligence for all minds, not so
No, I'm saying that if you were going to try to understand human mind by taking, the cellular processing coming up, you'd have to understand the dynamics as well, not just the static snapshot.
Yeah. This seems like a technical conversation about how you would go about using one technique or another, because even in Ken's technique, of course, he's not saying that just capturing the structure is enough. He's saying we need a library of all these dynamic functions. What does a certain type of cell do? How does it work? And then you would correlate those two. You would take the morphology and correlate it with the function, and then you would have something that works. Now there are possible problems with that, but that is how he's trying to say that. Well, Ken Hayworth wants to scan the brain at a resolution of, say, up to 5 nanometers on each side, so that, yeah. Like, yeah, you could estimate synapse strength by size and things like that, yeah. No, that's the other thing. It's not very clear that there's a one-to-one mapping between morphology and function, or parameters of function. Yeah, that can be an issue, yes, yeah. Okay, so
just take note of what are the separate steps. And I'd also comment that yes, we separate the data collection phase. The difference between would it be not necessarily present, but it's certainly, for instance, we have an example of I dark whatever, where they're in a simulation which may or may not be secure. But I agree with you. Yeah, I agree with I don't think it's very yeah. Okay. So I don't think you yeah. But the data they're inputting, definitely the data they're inputting is something.
yeah, I know you have to type because I can't. No.
That's definitely not going to be but that technique where the data might suffice.
Yeah. We have a question here from one person in the audience, whether we can pass, yeah. You can create the dynamics from the structure if you know the initial conditions, is what he said.
Okay, yes. So if you already know the parameters for all of these details, like the weights and all that, and then you have the structure, yes, that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yes. Yes, if you include all of that, right, which is a bit more than what, for example, the Atom would be capturing, yeah. I just wanted to bring up a technical issue here. We have requests from the virtual audience to pass around the mic to people, which is not really doable, but people who have comment might come here. So we have to think about that just a little moment. Suzanne, what do you think? Because it's becoming almost impossible to either rephrase everything and relay it or type it all in. So, yeah. Okay, so you're happy to go to the mic, basically? Yeah, maybe we'll do that. We can try that. See how it works. Yeah, actually going here physically to go to this mic. I know, but we could try it. Let's see. Sorry? Well, you can try that, but it's going to be difficult. Well, you can go to the mic, why not? Sure, since you don't mind.
So I have a proposal to put forth related to this slide, scale and resolution, which is, it seems that there's an open question as to what level of resolution we need to get to effectively simulate an individual mind or an intelligence at all. And we clearly don't have the capability to do this at any of the resolution that we'd like to do at the scale of a full human mind. So that's something we were talking about yesterday, which is taking a model organism. So the proposal at very high level is, could we do a ASIM nematode effectively? So the idea is that we would take the neural structure of a nematode, scan it at whatever level of resolution we believe we can get to, put it in that simulation with as close as we can come to an artificial body for it, if you will, and then see, do we get the same behavior out of that whole synthetic organism that we get out of the real organism, or substitute in your favorite organism of choice, but something with sufficiently low complexity that we would have a chance of being able to do it today. And the reason I suggest this is it seems to me that there are very few ways that we can actually answer early the question of what level of resolution do we need to get to in order to have a faithful simulation.
Now it gets harder to throw in comments. I actually have to be dedicated to.
Yeah, it's a big anti thing not to talk. Okay, so my it's a bit weird talking with this on. So my view is clearly it's way harder to do individual mind than generic mind, so we should start off with doing a generic mind. Secondly, it seems a bit way premature to talk about scale and resolution that would be needed to do an individual mind when we haven't even agreed philosophically what that would be, which includes discussions on consciousness and all the rest of it, which is a massive philosophical problem. So my view is we need to create an artificial generic mind first, use that algorithmic construct to compare it against the human mind, which we also know, and then maybe that will reveal some insights into what consciousness is, rather than just debating it. And only then can you even consider about what scale and resolution we need. Synapses, spiking neurons, why should we even, what about calcium ions? Go even further, molecular, atomic. We have no clue because you haven't even defined what individual mind is. We don't know what it is. What does it include? If I switch it on with all my data in some generic mind, is that me? No. So, and then there's the other problem with the nematode problem, and the reason why I disagree totally with Moda's view about simulating a rat. Even if you could somehow, we had the right technology to scan the rat completely, a single individual rat, all of his neurons, what I don't think those guys have really thought about is what it means to put that into the artificial virtual environment, see if it behaves correctly. Because actually, if you think about how to do this, incredibly hard engineering problem, because you'd actually have so you'd scan the brain of the rat, but you don't actually know what these individual bits do, the neurons do. So really, what you'd need is you'd have to wire up in your simulation the virtual rat foot neuron with his virtual foot in the virtual world that would then give the right feedback back to that virtual neuron. Otherwise, what effectively you're going to do is like taking our brains out of a jar, rewiring all our inputs just randomly, and then switching it on. You'll get cyclic embolism. So I think that engineering problem will be almost as difficult as understanding what the pieces of the brain are doing. So Anyway, that's my answer.
I see Ramez Nam is coming back to give a counter argument.
I see. So I think Demis's comments are great, actually, and they do reveal that there are multiple different paths. So I was jumping into kind of the structuralist simulation of the human brain path, and I'll say that kind of that the research proposal that I made as far as a step is along that line, and there may well be other lines. And I totally agree with you also that the building of the virtual environment and building of the virtual body will themselves be very challenging problems. And at the same time, I would suspect that, this is just a guess at this point, that the virtual body and virtual environment for a nematode is going to be far simpler than any aspect of a human mind, and possibly simpler than alternate AGI proposals. But I don't think we should necessarily be trying to produce a homogeneous single research path forward. I think it's totally legit that there are many different hypothetical paths to achieving an AGI, either in the generic sense or a single individual.
So it looks like there's a potential consensus there, because at least from the point of view of ASIM, as in how do you create substrate-independent minds, it's fine to have a path forward that includes doing things like how do you create a generic mind, something like an AGI first, and how do you move on from that. That would be a plausible route to get there if you're trying to make a roadmap of possible ways of achieving that goal. And what Ram is now try a specific organism and try to recreate that as a proof of concept, basically, that is also a very good idea, and one that has been bouncing around for ages. Actually, for quite a number of years, we've been thinking, why don't we do the nematode, or why don't we do some other organism, because the nematode has a few potential drawbacks, as Peter already told us in the chat, where he mentioned that it is not a very good example for a brain, a typical brain, because the nematode generally doesn't have spiking neurons, for example, and it doesn't quite work like most mammalian brains, let's just say, or even other, other typical brains. So since we've kind of talked about that, why don't we talk about the Me program a little bit more? If we can. I'm sorry. Can I? The touchpad and then. Oh, that's why? Okay. Can I advance the slide here, or does that have to happen right there? Just to go to the... You can skip the next... Actually, we'll go straight to the Me program thing. Oh, there we go. Me programs. So first of all, so that we know what we're talking about, just to explain this term, Me program, it came up yesterday, and I'll explain again, is this idea that we might be able to look at all people in general, just like you could look at any huge data set, and you can derive an average from that. You can look at that average and say, okay, this is what the typical system works like. That's the Me program. You might say that's an AGI, you might say that's some kind of generic person or something like that. And then you can look at the differences between individuals and that Me program and say something about that. For example, how big is the standard deviation there? Or what is, are they all really describable using the same basis functions? What can you really explain about what makes a certain person, an individual, different from that individual? So individual A from individual B, and why is Shane Legg not exactly the same person as Ramiz Nam? And so we can debate that and see how that may affect what you could do if you can describe, first of all, what a generic human brain would look like, and how you could maybe encode those differences to just capture an individual person. There are several reasons for talking about this. One of them is because there's already another route, let's just say, or another set of ideas floating around out there that you could capture by life logging, by writing down a lot of ideas about what you've done or what you would like to do, videos of yourself, your personality characteristics and stuff like that, and putting that into a program. This is something that, for instance, Bainbridge and Rothblatt are pursuing heavily, and use that as a way to preserve yourself for the future, a kind of upload of a sort. And though that method may seem to many of us, especially those of us coming from a neuroscience background or a more physics-based background or whichever, to be imprecise and potentially insufficient to describe a person, the general idea behind it that you could perhaps generate something generic and then capture individual specific parameters about character 1 or character 2 and put them into that generic program, that's not necessarily a bad idea. This is something to consider as a way of bootstrapping something like mind uploading or ASIM, basically. So I just wanted to chat about that a bit. So is that a sensible concept for ASIM?
You may be able to create sort of sketches of people that there are studies, right? I mean, we create these kinds of simulations, like plots group, terms of sometimes creating these simulations. My group is creating these simulations at a higher resolution, but they don't function like humans. We're creating sketches of people, right? To have conversations, learn, but they don't have. In that way, it may be a kind of a convergent evolution because it speaks our language. I mean, literally out loud and understands speech. So the question that I would have is maybe through this kind of very high level, gross kind of cognitive sketching, can we find out functional architecture, test them, then use those with higher granularity to study the actual human neuroscience, and maybe meet in the middle. In other words, the neuroscience approach, the really high resolution, high detailed physics-based approach to emulating human brain is bottom up, whereas this very fuzzy cognitive science top down. Now it might be that in the middle you determine scientifically that the Bainbridge Rothblatt approach is absolutely not resulting in just like with Shakespeare, you know. That program that requires a lot of So if you prepare for brain, and so we know that
Yeah.
so not just enough to take.
Yeah. I would like to add something to that and also relay this to the virtual environment. Basically, Shane Legg is telling us that if you had the idea of having a generic brain program, basically, and then feeding it a life experience, say a life log, to teach that brain how to be a specific person, so the nurture argument, that this may not be enough because there are differences, nature differences, let's say, genetic differences between different individuals. That's an interesting argument to make because this points out the different ways of thinking about how you would create a mean program versus a specific individual. Namely, when I said we can take the average and we can look at the differences between that average and other persons, I didn't necessarily mean that what you need to do is take a generic brain model and then use the Bainbridge-Rothblatt method to feed something through that. Instead, we can look at it in the same way that we did to create that generic model. We can say what we're looking at is what are the differences in terms of the patterns that the brain is taking on. So we know that there's supposed to be this many neurons over here, but we don't necessarily know how they're supposed to be organized. That's more of an individual thing. I'm just giving an example here. I'm not saying that that's exactly how it would work, but the general idea is look at the brain at the resolution that you would need to look at it. This is going back to the previous question, and then think in terms of averages versus a specific individual, and is the difference somehow giving you something that is easier to grasp or a smaller set? Is there any way that it gives you an advantage or benefit to even think in terms of me programs and differences to create or extract the data you need to recreate individual minds? Is that a route to go? Just thinking in terms of the general concept of subtracting, say, a mean from some specific sample to give you a difference. It doesn't have to be by using a life log. Yes?
Hi, by the way, my name is Tal.
Yeah, maybe could we do this?
Anything that they would be because of all kinds of subtleties, then if you sort of play that backwards, then there probably isn't any time t at which you could make the copy and then go to t+1 and have them still be the same. And so to me, that lends itself to the argument of putting a little more weight on the top-down approach, because to be sure, the bottom-up one has a ton of things to teach us and should be pursued, but to get progress going faster, if we're only going to be able to get sort of a representation at a point in time no matter which way we go, it seems to me the top-down approach is a little more accessible in sort of the current state that we find ourselves in. And so that's the way it's running around in my head anyway. I mean, you could almost think that if you had sort of, going back to our friend who was presenting, I forgot the guy's name, the wearable computer guy, is he here? Steve, yeah. If there was sort of a more advanced and complete set of that stuff, and you captured all the experiences up to any given point, then there'd be pretty good set of drivers for the top-down experiential view. But anyway.
It seems that the two aren't mutually exclusive. I mean, but bottom up neuroscience or maybe the physics. Sorry.
Yes. Hi, David Hansen speaking. The top-down seems to be like a powerful approach and has resulted in a lot of interesting cognitive models that have been useful for cognitive psychology and also useful for advances in artificial intelligence, real-world uses. But the bottom-up approach of computational neuroscience has resulted in some of the most striking advances in neuroscience in recent years, and it just has opened up more questions. It seems, even as exciting as the answers have been that it's generated. So, so that bottom-up approach, the questions that that have come up include related to the bottom-up approach is how much resolution is required to simulate a real human mind total. And that does appear to be many, many years out, right? I mean, but you have to tackle these questions and start addressing them. But in the meantime, we can continue to go top down with a sort of these sketches that get better over time, and the more computational neuroscience moves our understanding of actual brain forward, the better the top-down models become. So you wind up getting this kind of like increasing whole brain sketch from both directions, top down and bottom up.
We're interested generally in substrate-independent minds, so we're interested in any kind of a mind that is able to be instantiated in various types of implementations, but it is indeed our primary purpose or primary origin is the question of how do you get an individual mind of a person, something that is currently in a biological substrate, into another substrate. So yes, that is the original question. So, Max, you're saying there is no general program of the mind. There is basically no me program. There's no general me program you could instantiate every person and then just add in the differences that would make them. Right. Yeah, that's true. You don't really get around the scale problem as a whole by using the idea of a me program. The only thing that you could get from using the idea of a me program is that you would only need to tackle the worst case scenario, say the highest resolution problems and the greatest data amount once to create this generic me program. And then you look at the differences, which might be less data, may require less acquisition or something of that sort, and thereby have some gains. So that in the process, that would make things easier. Personally, I'm also skeptical about that, actually. So one of the reasons why I threw the question out there is to find out if we can, at this point, maybe already come up with some kind of conclusions about whether that is even a viable option or whether we can just say, me programs and differences, this is not a way to go for ASIM. Just because you will have to look at just as much data to create that difference between this average as you would have to if you were just recreating a single individual directly. Like say that you'd have to use the same process, no gains. Or that you have nothing really in the me program, that a generic me program doesn't exist.
assuming that there's some generic version of that that will allow me to get the rest of the experiences that are wired into that. They are into, so it's the OS basically. And the program OS and I'm going to write specific.
Yeah. Okay, so your comment is the me program basically the OS, and then you have programs written in there that would specifically do what you want to do, and that is you, that is yourself, that is your... No, it's kind of generic construct of a person, and all you need is this data that you've collected about individuals, and you put that into that generic construct, and then there you have a reinstantiation of the person. So the idea behind it is, actually, all of us are extraordinarily similar. There's very little difference. Being conscious, being who you are, is a very simple program. It's something that nature put into all of us in basically the same way, and then there are little differences that are tweaked in by all the memories you've accumulated, the experiences, which therefore change your behavior, etc., etc., etc. That's the idea behind that route. And so I'm throwing it out there and saying, does that route make any sense? Or is that too simplistic?
Running them side by side. And are they identical? And it's hard to say. More identically, are they the same person? Did you have to interface something inherently that was completely different? Does it, as in T1, T2, does that change the individual? I don't know what I'm saying makes sense. Really high level. Maybe the new programs scan a lot like this. We need but I'd rather have full scan than running in a full, simulation, then trying to figure out how to plug that out.
Okay.
You sort of hooked up with maybe after you've done uploads, you'll be like, okay, yeah, I think we can kind of generalize it now. But I mean,
Okay, so Michael Andrade is suggesting that if you have a lot of data already, if you have a lot of uploads, just say, then perhaps you can extract out some sort of average, something that would be generalizable, even though you don't know what that means. You don't know if that converts into any kind of usable functions or anything like that. It's just some kind of general mean that you take out, and then, I don't know, does that simplify your task in doing future uploads or something like that? That's... Yeah, but is it though? That's the question. Would that be a way to collect less data, really? I mean, maybe in storage terms, it's less storage, but is it less acquisition? Pushed it right to the top. Yeah, you can try to get it from the back sheet. Yes. Is it supposed to be in the middle? Well, it didn't really. It was the noise problem, right? It was giving us that huge amount of noise as we move around. That's the reason why we switched. I have no idea why that is.